Every rise, every fall, every migration, every famine, every invention, it all traces back to moisture, rivers, monsoons, drought cycles, aquifers, glaciers, and rainfall stability. What if civilization was never built by humans, but by water? Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to drift into a different kind of history. One shaped not by kings or empires, but by the quiet physics of rivers that stop, rains that move, and landscapes that decide when human stories can begin. You're watching Sleepless Homo. Soft science, slow storytelling, and deep time for tired minds who still want to learn. We're humble researchers here, digging through sediment, manuscript, and memory to understand how water has always been the first architect of civilization. Now imagine this: a world without borders, without cities, without the carved lines that later rulers would insist were permanent. Picture a landscape where the only lines that truly mattered were the faint arcs of moisture moving across continents, shifting with seasons that no one yet understood. In this early world, long before the 4th millennium, before the Common Era, and far earlier than any recorded kingdom, the first boundaries were not drawn by human hands. They were traced by water, appearing in the form of shallow lakes, brief grasslands, and the narrow margins of springs that surfaced and vanished in rhythm, with climates that pulsed over tens of thousands of years. What if I told you that the earliest map any human ever followed was not carved into stone or etched on hide, but shaped by rainfall itself, drawing invisible corridors through deserts that were not yet deserts? We do not know for certain when the first groups understood that these patterns could be trusted, yet the evidence suggests they moved in quiet alignment with the land, gathering wherever moisture lingered and dispersing when it withdrew. Paleoclimate reconstructions allow us to see this world more clearly, through a combination of fossil lake sediments, isotopic signatures in ancient shells, and geological traces left behind by long-vanished wetlands. A pattern emerges that is both humbling and precise. The oldest clusters of early human activity in northern Africa do not align randomly. They follow the shifting positions of ancient rainfall corridors, marking paths that monsoon systems once carried across what is now the Sahara. At certain intervals, roughly every 20,000 years, the wobble of the Earth's orbit allowed storms to reach deep into the continent. Lakes filled, rivers formed, grasslands spread. And across this temporarily green expanse, early humans gathered, hunted, and rested in landscapes that are now fields of sand. When the monsoon retreated, these corridors closed, and the people moved with them. We can see the memory of these vanished worlds in the fossil lake beds scattered across northern Africa, some stretching for dozens of kilometres across basins that today hold nothing but wind. Satellite imagery reveals their outlines with startling clarity, showing shorelines, ancient inlets, and the faint crusts of minerals left behind as the last water evaporated. In the sediments of these former lakes, researchers find pollen from grasses and aquatic plants that could never survive in the modern Sahara. They find bones of hippos, crocodiles, fish, and birds that require year-round water. These traces do not lie. They show where the monsoon rains once reached, and they show that humans were there the moment water made life possible. The pattern repeats itself in the archaeology of hunter-gatherer camps. Stone tools, hearths, and butchered animal remains cluster around the margins of springs that emerged briefly during wetter phases. These springs are dry today, their limestone cavities empty. The sediment layers around them reveal multiple occupations separated by centuries, suggesting that people returned again and again each time the water table rose. In the absence of permanent rivers, such springs were lifelines, their reliability determined by rainfall far beyond the horizon. We do not know the names or languages of the people who camped there, but the evidence suggests they understood these locations were transient gifts. They did not settle permanently because the water itself didn't remain. Researchers investigating the deep cores of Saharan sediments see a more dramatic rhythm. Layer by layer, they uncover alternating traces of green and desert periods. Thin bands of clay indicate times when rainfall was strong enough to sustain lakes and vegetation. Above them lie layers of coarse sand, marking sudden desiccation when the monsoon retreated. These transitions were not slow. In some regions, the shift from habitable grassland to hyper-arid desert may have occurred in as little as a few centuries. For the people living there, the world did not gradually change. It reorganized itself with decisive finality. A place that had supported thousands of grazing animals and human communities became lifeless. These changes were not caused by human activity. They were the consequence of orbital cycles, solar radiation patterns, and atmospheric feedback loops far beyond human influence. The earliest wells in the Levant offer yet another window into this ancient hydrological reality. Their depths, often reaching more than 20 metres, show how far early communities were willing to dig to reach reliable groundwater. These wells, dated to more than 6,000 years before the Common Era, mark the precise limits of where human settlement could remain stable. Beyond certain elevations, the groundwater lay too deep to extract with the tools of the time, and so early communities clustered in narrow ecological bands, close enough to extract water, far enough to avoid flood danger, but never beyond the invisible threshold where moisture fell, below what the human body could tolerate during prolonged dry seasons. The physiology of early humans was identical to ours. They required a minimum daily intake of water to maintain body temperature and metabolic function. They could not outrun dehydration. In regions where rainfall dropped below a certain threshold for more than one season, large groups could not remain. Hunger could be endured for a time, thirst could not. This basic biological limit created a silent boundary, shaping early mobility long before tools, hierarchies, or planning emerged. People did not choose where to live. Water chose for them. And so when we speak of the origins of civilization, it is easy to imagine that the first major shift was technological. The shaping of stone, the use of fire, the cultivation of the first grains. But the evidence suggests something subtler. Long before ingenuity, long before planned irrigation or storage, early humans responded to a different kind of teacher. They obeyed the geography of rainfall, the movement of lakes, and the rhythm of monsoon systems that no one controlled and few could predict. Civilization began not as a triumph of human will, but as a quiet obedience to the physics of water distribution. People gathered where it lingered. They left when it withdrew. These early choices formed pathways that would later become trade routes, settlement clusters, and eventually the foundations of the first cities. Water drew the first map even if no one saw it. The realization is simple but profound. Humanity's earliest borders were not political or cultural, they were hydrological. Understanding this allows us to see the deeper continuity across all later civilizations. Whether in river valleys, fertile plains, or highland springs, the earliest patterns of human settlement reflect a consistent truth. People could not remain where moisture fell below survival thresholds. Every later development, from agriculture to writing to urban planning, took shape within that ancient constraint. We do not know the names of the individuals who first understood these patterns, yet their decisions created the foundation for everything that followed, and eventually people stopped following water and began trying to hold it in place. If you enjoy these calm late-night journeys through deep history, a gentle like and subscribe helps other sleepless sapiens find this corner of quiet education. Tell me in the comments where or how you listen. Before sleep, while cooking, on long drives, or with headphones in the dark. I read them all. And if you drift off, don't worry. Timestamps are waiting whenever you return. All right, let's continue. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Picture a moment when a river becomes more than water. Imagine a world where the steady rise of a single flood becomes the closest thing to a calendar, a promise, and a warning all at once. Along the narrow green ribbon that cut through an otherwise inhospitable desert, people learned to read the pulse of the Nile long before they understood the arithmetic of kingship or the architecture of stone. How does a river that never quite fails become the architect of one of the longest-lived civilizations? We do not know for certain when the people of the Nile first realized that its annual inundation could be anticipated rather than merely endured, but the evidence suggests they observed its moods with a precision unmatched by any other ancient society. This river, rising from distant sources they could not see, arrived each year with a rhythm that gradually narrowed from chaotic cycles to a reliable pulse during the early dynastic periods. And in that narrowing, something remarkable happened. The foundations of centralized planning quietly took shape, guided not by conquest, but by the steady reach of water across a predictable floodplain. The revelation becomes clearer when we look at the earliest Nilometer inscriptions, carved into stone and wood to record the flood heights year after year. Some of these inscriptions, dating to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, document individual measurements with a consistency that suggests a society deeply invested in understanding its river. Their marks show not only abundance but warning. A flood too low meant hardship approaching, while a flood too high could tear through embankments and drown entire fields before the seeds had time to take root. These records reveal an intimacy between people and river unmatched in the ancient world. Through them we can see how the seemingly gentle annual rise of water became a metric of social stability, a boundary between prosperity and crisis, and the earliest tool for state authority. The Nile became the architect because it taught its people to measure, to prepare, and eventually to govern. The geography of the floodplain shaped this relationship in ways that archaeology continues to illuminate. Unlike the violent, shifting rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile spread across its valley in a broad, even sheet, depositing layers of fertile silt each year. This consistent geometry allowed settlements to form in narrow bands along slightly elevated ridges, natural levees shaped by centuries of deposition. Excavations reveal that these ridges influenced the linear arrangement of villages, storage facilities, and early administrative buildings. The land itself dictated the design, with agricultural fields falling into predictable zones of saturation and drainage. This spatial logic created the physical template upon which later pharaonic authority would build, but the foundation had been laid long before, in the way the river carved its own borders across the landscape. The link between high floods and political stability became particularly evident during the Old Kingdom, a period beginning toward the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. During years of generous inundation, harvests flourished, granaries filled, and monumental projects could proceed without interruption. The Great Pyramids, for instance, align historically with sequences of favourable floods that supported a surplus capable of sustaining massive workforces. But archaeological layers from times of diminished inundation tell a different story. In regions where excavations have exposed storage pits and household debris, analysts have found clear indicators of famine, truncated grain layers, evidence of dietary stress in human remains and sudden reductions in craft production. These layers correspond with the low Nile years documented in Nilometer inscriptions, underscoring the tight correlation between hydrological rhythms and political cohesion. In the Old Kingdom's later centuries, inscriptions referencing social unrest and regional fragmentation coincide with several decades of below-average floods. The pattern is not mythic but measurable. When the water withdrew, the ordering principles of the state weakened. We do not know precisely how ordinary people understood the link between river and governance, but the archaeological evidence suggests the connection was felt intimately. When a country rests along a single river corridor, its stability is only as secure as the predictability of that river. Another insight emerges from the early irrigation basins that took shape during these formative centuries. These basins redirected floodwaters into controlled areas, allowing communities to regulate irrigation over longer periods. Such structures required coordinated labour, planning, and maintenance far beyond what small kin groups could organise on their own. As these basins grew in scale, so too did the authority required to administer them. The management of water became a form of statecraft, where officials documented water levels, oversaw distribution, and regulated the timing of floodgate openings. These actions were not merely administrative conveniences, they were necessary responses to the river's variability. Water management became power not through decree but through necessity. The stability associated with the Nile's dependable pattern cannot be overstated. Unlike other ancient river systems where shifts in course could devastate entire regions, the Nile's path remained relatively constant over millennia. This reliability created an environment where planning was possible, where agricultural strategies could be standardized, and where population centers could grow with confidence. It was this predictability that enabled Egypt's extraordinary longevity, spanning from its early dynastic phases through the Middle and New Kingdoms and into the first millennium before the Common Era. Civilizations elsewhere rose and fell amid shifting waters, but Egypt endured because its river held its course. Yet archaeological layers remind us that the river was not infallible. Periods of low inundation, such as those documented during the First Intermediate Period, reveal profound vulnerability. Excavations from this era show sudden shifts in diet, indications of internal strife, and inscriptions lamenting social disorder. These layers correspond to flood measurements recorded on nilometers that fell well below the optimal range. In these moments, the margin between order and collapse narrowed dramatically. Egypt's endurance did not stem from defying the desert, but from inhabiting the fragile boundary where water made life stable enough to thrive. The desert pressed in on all sides, and the people lived close enough to feel its breath, yet not so close that its dryness overcame them. Through all of this, the Nile remained both generous and demanding. It provided the conditions for a centralized, literate and monumental society, but its generosity was conditional. The predictable rhythm of its inundation during the early dynastic periods allowed for planning, but this very predictability made deviations all the more consequential. When the river rose too little or too late, the shockwaves spread through households, temples and palaces alike. Yet even in such times, Egyptians returned to their river with a trust born from millennia of observation. They built their cities along its banks, aligned their fields to its retreating waters, and carved their measurements into stone. Egypt did not conquer the desert. It inhabited the narrow margin where water held the line between order and collapse. Its greatness emerged not from dominance over nature, but from cooperation with a river that shaped the land slowly, predictably, and with a discipline that no ruler could imitate. When we look back at this civilization, spanning thousands of years, we see not simply the achievements of a people, but the enduring influence of a river that never quite failed. It created a corridor of life in an otherwise barren landscape, and taught its inhabitants how to measure, track, and rely on rhythms larger than themselves. But not every river offered such generosity. Picture a moment when a river decides it no longer wishes to flow past the cities that depend upon it. Imagine the quiet shock of waking to find that the water, which had shaped your fields, fed your livestock and defined your horizon, has shifted its path without warning. What happens when a river that sustained empires simply changes course? We do not know for certain how the people of ancient northern Mesopotamia first realized the Euphrates was abandoning them, but archaeology suggests it was not through a single catastrophe. Rather, the river slipped away over years that accumulated quietly, bending several kilometers west during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, leaving settlements stranded and canal systems stretching into dry earth. The revelation appears most clearly in excavation layers where irrigation channels, once meticulously maintained, suddenly end in sand. These abandoned cuts are not symbolic. They are physical proof that the river had stepped aside. When water withdraws, it leaves behind the blunt geometry of its absence, and the earliest signs of collapse are not toppled walls but empty channels waiting for a flow that never returns. As we move through the archaeological landscape of this period, we encounter canal systems that once formed the arteries of early agricultural societies. These systems depended on a predictable relationship between river and settlement, where engineers carved narrow channels to redirect water into fields of barley, date palms, and flax. Yet in some sites these channels lie cracked and desiccated, preserving the moment when they cease to reach the river's edge. Their alignment points toward a course the Euphrates no longer followed. We do not know precisely how long the people attempted to extend or deepen these canals, but sediment analysis suggests that efforts were made and abandoned in quick succession. Once the river shifted far enough, no amount of human labour could restore the flow. Without water, the fields dried, livestock wandered elsewhere, and the settlements that had grown around the canal networks began to empty. The exposed floodplains left behind by the retreating river reveal another quiet consequence: rapid salinization. Over-irrigation combined with high evaporation rates drew dissolved salts to the soil surface. In regions where the floodplains were no longer replenished by silt-rich water, these salts accumulated in layers thick enough to prevent crops from germinating. Soil samples show increasing salinity levels during the centuries surrounding the Euphrates shift, indicating that once fertile fields became hostile to agriculture in a matter of decades. Salinization is not dramatic to look at. It does not announce itself with destruction. Instead, it slowly renders land unusable, turning earth pale and brittle. For the people who lived there, the change would have been devastating. A field that once supported generations could become unproductive within a few seasons, leaving farmers with little to harvest and less to hope for. This ecological transformation appears not only in soil chemistry, but also in the written record. Clay tablets recovered from administrative archives reference "fields turned bitter," a phrase scholars interpret as a reference to salt-poisoned soils. These tablets, written in the cuneiform script of the Akkadian period, document complaints from farmers unable to meet their quotas and record appeals to officials for grain rations. We do not know the tone of these voices, but the words convey a growing frustration and a recognition that their landscape was changing in ways they could not easily reverse. The tablets also show a shift in the economic structure, with resources being redirected to support regions less affected by the environmental decline. In this sense, the documentary record aligns with the archaeological one, creating a coherent picture of a society facing the slow, relentless consequences of hydrological change. This period coincides with a broader megadrought that swept across the Near East during the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Paleoclimate data from Lake Kors and Speleothems shows a sharp decline in regional precipitation. The Akkadian Empire, which had expanded across Mesopotamia under Sargon and his successors, began to fragment during the same interval. Archaeologists find evidence of reduced agricultural output, population displacement, and the fortification of settlements previously open to trade. While it would be an oversimplification to claim the megadrought alone ended the empire, it is clear that diminished water availability placed immense strain on the political and economic systems. The empire's administrative apparatus depended on stable agricultural surpluses, and without them, the ability to maintain roads, supply armies, and support distant provinces weakened. The fragmentation of the empire reflects this environmental pressure, suggesting that ecological instability contributed to political dissolution. Further evidence of regional aridification comes from radiocarbon-dated dust deposits found in northern Mesopotamian settlement layers. These deposits, formed during intense dust storms, indicate periods when vegetation cover thinned and soils were exposed to wind erosion. Geologists trace the origin of this dust to areas that had once supported agriculture, but had dried enough to be carried away in storms. These layers are not isolated. They appear across multiple sites, offering a regional signal of climate deterioration. When combined with settlement abandonment patterns and the dry canals reaching into empty space, the story becomes clear. It is a story not of sudden collapse, but of gradual environmental change that exceeded the capacity of human adaptation in that time and place. When we bring these lines of evidence together, the realization emerges with quiet clarity. The empire did not fall in the dramatic sense often imagined in tales of ancient decline. Rather, the river stepped aside, and the land followed. The shifting course of the Euphrates altered the hydrological foundation upon which the society had been built. Without water, fields withered, populations moved, and political cohesion weakened. Human ingenuity could not overcome the geological and climatic forces that reshaped the landscape. Empires are not abstract constructs. They depend on the continued functioning of rivers, soils, and rains. When those elements change, the structures built upon them change too. In the end, the abandonment of these settlements and the dissolution of the Akkadian state were not failures of leadership or culture. They were responses to a shifting environment that no administrative decree could correct. Archaeology reveals this truth patiently, through layers of silt, inscriptions of complaint, and the dry channels that once carried life. It reminds us that rivers are not passive features of a landscape. They move, they abandon, they reshape, and civilizations must adjust or disappear. Far to the east, another civilization listened to the monsoon instead of a river. A city built without kings, without armies, without monuments proclaiming the victories of rulers whose names we no longer remember. Picture instead an urban world arranged around wells, courtyards and streets so precisely aligned that they suggest not hierarchy, but consensus. A society sustained by rivers and rains rather than by crowns. How does such a world unravel without a single recorded battle? To answer this, we must turn to the ancient Indus Valley, where an urban civilization flourished for centuries before thinning quietly into the dry air. There is no inscription describing its decline, no palace records lamenting invasion. What remains instead is a geological story written in meltwater, isotopes, and the slow weakening of rivers that once carried snowmelt from the distant Himalayas. The revelation comes from isotope studies of ancient river sediments, allowing researchers to trace the origins of the water that once fed the Indus system. These analyses show that during the second millennium before the Common Era, the rivers weakened as monsoon intensity declined, altering both the volume and the seasonal rhythm of flow, while earlier generations believed the Indus was a single mighty river. We now understand it as a braided network, sensitive to shifts in rainfall and snowmelt. As the climate dried, this network contracted. Channels that once supported large settlements narrowed or disappeared, forcing cities to adjust to conditions they had not been built to endure. We do not know for certain how quickly people recognized that their water supply was failing, but the archaeological layers suggest the transition was gradual enough to avoid panic, yet steady enough to reshape an entire civilization. One of the clearest signs comes from the wells of Mohenjo-Daro, a city renowned for its sophisticated water management. Across stratigraphic levels, these wells grow deeper, indicating that groundwater levels were falling. Early wells reach shallow aquifers, while later constructions extend far below, each brick-lined shaft reaching for water that was retreating into the earth. The stones of these wells tell a quiet story of adaptation. They record not collapse but persistence, an attempt to follow the water downward as the rivers thinned. Yet deepening wells can only sustain a city for so long. When water tables fall beneath a certain threshold, settlement becomes untenable. Excavation layers show that some wells were eventually abandoned mid-construction, their final courses of brick left incomplete, as if the builders realised the task was no longer worth the effort. Abandoned reservoirs provide another layer of evidence. These structures once captured seasonal floods and served as buffers during years of reduced rainfall. Over time, however, sediment cores taken from these basins show that they held less water and accumulated more silt. The reduced inflow corresponds with the weakening of the monsoon, suggesting that reservoirs became increasingly unreliable. In some regions, the channels feeding these basins dried entirely, leaving the structures to gather dust rather than water. These abandoned reservoirs reveal not negligence but the limits of human engineering in the face of climate shifts. When rivers decline, reservoirs cannot compensate indefinitely. Changes in agriculture offer yet another clue. Early Indus settlements cultivated barley, a grain that requires ample water during key stages of growth. But as the climate dried, evidence from plant remains and stable isotope analysis shows that communities shifted toward drought-tolerant millets. This transition marks a pragmatic adjustment to declining river discharge. Millet requires less water, grows on poorer soils, and can endure variable rainfall. Yet it also yields less and demands different cultivation strategies. The shift suggests that communities were adapting to harsher conditions, but it also indicates that the agricultural surplus necessary to sustain large cities was becoming harder to maintain. Over time, this agricultural contraction would have strained social networks, trade relationships, and population density. Long-distance trade routes, once supported by river navigation, began to falter as well. Archaeological evidence shows a decline in the presence of imported materials such as lapis lazuli, carnelian, and various metals during the late phases of the Indus civilization. These goods once travelled along rivers that functioned as economic arteries. As channels dried or became shallow, boats could no longer pass, and overland routes proved less efficient. The disappearance of these goods from settlement layers reflects the narrowing of economic horizons, a constriction of the world that once linked the Indus to Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Without navigable rivers, merchants faced greater risks and lower returns, and long-distance exchange diminished, isolating cities that had once thrived on connectivity. Settlement patterns reveal the final stage of this transformation. Dense urban centres such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show signs of declining population, while smaller rural settlements become more common in the later layers. This dispersal suggests that people left the cities not in response to sudden crisis, but because urban life became less viable as water sources grew unstable. Villagers moved closer to the shrinking rivers or into areas where groundwater remained accessible. This process did not produce dramatic destruction. Instead, it produced quiet abandonment. Walls were left standing, streets remained intact, but the human presence thinned until only faint traces remained. Archaeologists find that many cities lost their formal layout and public infrastructure during this phase, indicating a shift toward localized, smaller-scale living. When we consider all these lines of evidence together, the realization is clear. The Indus world did not collapse in the sense of violent overthrow or dramatic ruin. It dissolved into the dry air as its rivers thinned. The civilization's strength had always rested on its ability to manage water through wells, reservoirs and floodplain design. But when the monsoon weakened and the rivers contracted, these systems could no longer sustain dense populations. The people adapted for as long as they could, deepening wells, altering crops, shifting trade routes, and dispersing into smaller settlements. Yet even the most adaptable societies must eventually align with the environment that supports them. The Indus people did not disappear. They simply reorganized their lives around new hydrological realities. This quiet transformation stands in contrast to the dramatic narratives often associated with ancient decline. There were no burning cities, no conquering armies, no final battles recorded in stone. Instead, the Indus story reminds us that civilizations can diminish without violence, leaving behind not ruins of conflict but the subtle signs of environmental change. Deepened wells, empty reservoirs, barley replaced by millet, and streets gradually emptied of travellers. It shows us that collapse is sometimes a slow dispersal rather than an abrupt end. And in the far west, another people built canals that reached for water that was already leaving. A landscape so carefully shaped by human hands that water seems to obey rather than meander. Picture a world of channels etched across the earth in geometric lines, carrying river water into fields that had once been barren. Now imagine this system growing, stretching farther each year, expanding with the confidence of a people who believe they had mastered their land. What does irrigation look like when it becomes more ambitious than the land that supports it? To answer this, we must return to ancient Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest hydraulic engineers carved canals across vast plains, turning dry earth into farmland and farmland into the economic foundation of the earliest known cities. But the same vision that created these systems carried within it a quiet flaw. In time, the water brought not only life, but a slow transformation that could not be undone. We do not know precisely when the farmers of Sumer first noticed that their soil was changing, but the evidence suggests the process unfolded gradually as irrigation intensified. River water, though essential for crops, contained dissolved salts that accumulated in the fields as evaporation pulled moisture upward under the hot Mesopotamian sun. Over decades, and then centuries, this process raised soil salinity to levels that crops could no longer tolerate. The revelation comes not from a single dramatic event, but from agricultural records that chart a steady decline in barley yields. These records, preserved on clay tablets from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, detail harvests from estates, temples, and household plots. Early entries report strong yields, but later lines show decreasing amounts, suggesting that the land itself was losing its fertility. Barley, the most salt-tolerant of their staple crops, began to fail. When barley struggles, the underlying problem is no longer agricultural technique, but soil chemistry. Archaeologists have uncovered salt crust layers in abandoned fields across southern Mesopotamia. thin but distinctive, these layers form when saline water rises through the soil and evaporates, leaving behind bright mineral deposits. In some areas, the crust lies just beneath later occupational layers, indicating that fields were abandoned relatively quickly once salinity reached critical levels. The fields did not disappear, they hardened. These deposits show how the land responded to prolonged irrigation without adequate drainage. Mesopotamian engineers, despite their remarkable achievements, lack the ability to flush salts deeply enough into the subsurface to restore soil productivity. And once salts accumulated, the earth could sustain only low-yield crops or none at all. The crusts remain today as quiet signatures of a complex system pushed beyond its ecological limits. The scale of irrigation networks may have accelerated this problem. As cities expanded, their canal systems reached farther into marginal terrain that had not been naturally replenished by river floods. These marginal areas required more intensive management, drawing more water and further increasing the rate of salinization. Excavations reveal canals extending into land that was only barely arable even under optimal conditions. Tablets referencing construction of new channels and maintenance of older ones show a society continually extending its hydraulic reach, perhaps because previously fertile zones were losing productivity. We do not know whether these expansions were celebrated as signs of growth or understood as signs of strain, but the archaeological traces suggest a pattern of increasingly ambitious water management in the face of declining yields. Removing salt from irrigated soils poses an engineering challenge rarely solved in pre-modern civilizations. The most effective solutions involve leaching soils with large volumes of fresh water and maintaining drainage systems capable of carrying salts away. But in southern Mesopotamia, where rainfall was minimal and the water table lay close to the surface, leaching was difficult. Attempts to drain fields often resulted in waterlogging, further reducing fertility. Clay-rich soils trapped salts near the root zone, making it nearly impossible to restore productivity once salinization surpassed a certain threshold. This challenge becomes apparent in the archaeological record through changes in canal design. Some channels were widened or deepened in what appears to be an effort to increase flow volume, but sediment accumulation and the flatness of the plain limited these options. As the environment imposed constraints, technological innovation could slow but not reverse the salinity trend. The agricultural decline had political consequences. Cities dependent on failing farmland struggled to maintain their populations and institutional structures. Administrative tablets from the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era mention food shortages and increased grain rationing, suggesting that governments were under pressure to redistribute dwindling resources. Trade networks shifted as cities that once exported grain began importing it. The political weakening that followed appears not as sudden collapse but as a gradual diffusion of authority. City-states that had once prospered from irrigated agriculture became vulnerable to both environmental stress and external pressures. In some cases, neighbouring regions with healthier soils gained influence, while those relying heavily on salinized lands lost their economic leverage. Archaeology reveals this transformation through abandoned settlements, changes in ceramic distribution, and shifts in administrative centres. One of the more striking findings from this period comes from the remains of settlements that were never rebuilt. Excavations show houses left intact, with household items still in place, suggesting that people departed when the land could no longer support them. The absence of destruction implies that the cause was not conflict but the slow erosion of agricultural viability. These settlements illustrate the limits of even the most sophisticated irrigation systems. Mesopotamian farmers could redirect water, build embankments, and maintain expansive canal networks, but they could not negotiate with the chemistry of evaporating water. Once salinity reached a critical level, the land no longer responded to human intention. This realization shifts how we understand the rise and fall of the earliest Mesopotamian cities. Their achievements were extraordinary: standardized bricks, monumental temples, administrative writing, and elaborate ritual practices. Yet beneath this cultural complexity lay an ecological reality that governed everything. Water enabled their growth, and water, transformed by evaporation, contributed to their decline. The people of Sumer did not miscalculate. They built within the limits of their world. When those limits tightened, their society adapted in every way it could until adaptation was no longer possible. These insights remind us that ancient civilizations were deeply entangled with the environments they shaped. Hydraulic systems could create stability, but only temporarily. Overextension of irrigation networks, combined with the inherent properties of the region's soils and climate, created conditions that no political structure could withstand indefinitely. In the end, the story of Mesopotamian irrigation is not about overreach, but about the delicate balance between human ingenuity and environmental constraint. Even the most sophisticated hydraulic systems could not negotiate with the chemistry of evaporating water. Yet some societies interpreted failing water not as physics, but as a sign from the gods. A world where the boundary between hunger and belief is measured not in years, but in seasons. Picture a landscape where crops fail, rivers thin, and people search not only the horizon for clouds, but the heavens for meaning. How does a changing climate alter not only harvests, but cosmologies? To answer this, we must step into the Late Bronze Age, a period in which kingdoms across Anatolia and the Levant confronted prolonged drought. Their fields withered, their granaries strained, and their rulers struggled to explain the silence of the skies. We do not know for certain how ordinary households interpreted these changes, but the evidence suggests that as rains faltered, belief systems recalibrated. What emerged was not simply desperation, but a reshaping of the relationship between humans and the divine. The revelation lies in texts preserved on clay tablets from Hittite and Ugaritic archives. These documents describe divine anger during precisely the years that paleoclimate data identifies as periods of severe drought. In Anatolia, prayers addressed to the storm gods plead for the return of rain, acknowledging the fields that had dried and the people who suffered. These prayers do not merely ask for relief, they interpret drought as a sign of cosmic imbalance, a rupture in the covenant between deity and kingdom. Meanwhile, in Ugarit, myths begin to reframe the storm god's role, portraying him not only as a bringer of rain, but as a figure whose displeasure could withhold it. The textual evidence reveals a consciousness shaped by environmental stress. When the sky stopped giving, people sought reasons in the unseen. Archaeological traces from this period align closely with these written testimonies. Excavations of granaries and storage pits show evidence of grain rationing, with layers indicating reduced quantities and increased signs of redistribution. Storage vessels from palace centres sometimes contain only thin residual traces of grain, suggesting that reserves were stretched during prolonged shortages. In some palace complexes, administrative tablets document emergency measures to supply struggling regions. The concentration of food in elite centres diminished as rulers attempted to compensate for failing harvests. These actions reflect a recognition that the drought was not temporary, but part of a pattern requiring structural adjustment. Yet even these efforts proved insufficient in the long term. Evidence from coastal sites indicates heightened migration pressures during this same period. Archaeologists identify sudden increases in non-local pottery styles, shifts in settlement density, and signs of temporary encampments. These patterns suggest that people moved toward the coast in search of more stable water sources, where fishing and maritime trade offered alternatives to failing inland agriculture. However, coastal settlements were not designed to absorb large populations, and the archaeological layers show signs of rapid adaptation, including hastily constructed dwellings and expanded refuse zones. The pressures created by these movements further strained local resources and intensified social stress. These migrations were not necessarily dramatic waves, but rather steady accumulations of displaced people, following patterns dictated by diminishing rainfall. The weakening of palace economies forms another layer of this story. Late Bronze Age kingdoms depended heavily on agricultural tribute to sustain their administrative and military structures. When harvest declined, so did the flow of goods into palaces and temples. Records from this period show reductions in offerings, diminished inventories, and decreased capacity to maintain key infrastructure. Workshops that once produced luxury goods show reduced output, indicating that the economic base supporting elite activity was eroding. Over time, this erosion contributed to broader political instability, as rulers could no longer guarantee support for their dependents or enforce authority across increasingly distressed territories. Collapse did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded gradually as the environmental pressures exceeded the capacity of palace systems to adapt. The transformation of belief during this period reflects a deep interplay between environment and worldview. Hittite prayers preserved on tablets capture a tone of both reverence and desperation. One prayer describes a land scorched by the absence of rain, invoking the storm god's mercy with a plea that acknowledges human frailty. The language suggests that drought was understood not as a random event but as a divine message. In Ugaritic texts, myths involving the storm god Baal shift to emphasize cycles of fertility and barrenness, portraying the god's temporary defeat or withdrawal as explanations for drought. These mythic adjustments show how cosmologies responded to environmental change. When the earth no longer offered stability, people looked upward to restore meaning. Yet the reinterpretation of divine roles was not uniform. Different regions adapted their narratives according to local conditions and political structures. Some texts emphasize ritual solutions, urging renewed devotion, or specific offerings to restore cosmic balance. Others adopt a more fatalistic tone, accepting drought as part of a larger divine plan. Archaeologists find evidence of increased ritual activity in some temple complexes during this period, including larger quantities of votive offerings and expansions of sacred spaces. These practices indicate attempts to negotiate with the divine, using ritual as a bridge between human need and cosmic forces. We do not know whether people believed these actions would alter the weather, but the persistence of these rituals suggests a belief in the power of intercession. The social consequences of these shifts were profound. As resources diminished, communities became more dependent on shared interpretations of the crisis. Belief offered a framework for understanding and responding to environmental stress. It provided explanations for suffering and strategies for action. In some cases, belief may have offered comfort in the face of uncertainty, reinforcing social cohesion. In others, it may have contributed to tensions if different groups interpreted the drought in conflicting ways. The archaeological record, though silent on individual experiences, shows changes in settlement patterns, food distribution, and ritual activity that reflect a world in transition. When we look at this convergence of climate data, archaeological evidence, and textual sources, a clear realization emerges. When water vanished, People sought explanations in the heavens because the earth had stopped answering. Their prayers, myths, and rituals were not expressions of ignorance, but of engagement with a world that no longer behaved as expected. They interpreted drought not simply as environmental failure, but as a message, a rupture in a relationship that required interpretation. These belief systems reveal the deep human desire to make sense of suffering, to locate cause and remedy in realms beyond immediate perception. The cosmologies of the late Bronze Age were shaped by the rhythms of rain, and when those rhythms faltered, belief systems adjusted in ways that echoed across generations. But on distant islands, water scarcity shaped something else entirely, migration itself, ration. Imagine the moment when a shoreline no longer feels like home. Picture a small island where streams have thinned, where the taste of drinking water grows faintly brackish, where cisterns echo with emptiness, and where the horizon begins to feel less like a boundary and more like an invitation. What pushes a people to abandon familiar shores and sail into vast uncertainty? We do not know for certain how the first great waves of Pacific voyagers decided to leave their islands, but evidence suggests that the impulse to depart was not born solely from curiosity or exploration. Instead, the timing of their movements aligns with patterns in the land itself, particularly with the availability of fresh water. The choices that shaped one of humanity's greatest seafaring traditions may have emerged not from abundance, but from thirst. The revelation comes from pollen records preserved in lake sediments across the Pacific. These cores, extracted from volcanic craters, marshes, and ancient water bodies, reveal a subtle but consistent pattern. Freshwater scarcity often preceded major waves of inter-island migration during the first millennium before the Common Era. Layers from this period show shifts in vegetation, with drought-tolerant species replacing those that require steady moisture. Reduced pollen from forest trees suggests declining canopy cover, possibly due to both climate variability and intensified land use. When the climate grew drier and rainfall became unreliable, freshwater sources on small islands would have been among the first to feel the strain. These pollen records act as quiet witnesses, documenting the ecological pressures that may have nudged communities toward the sea. Water scarcity on small islands arises quickly because aquifers are limited. Unlike continental land masses, where groundwater can accumulate in vast subsurface systems, island aquifers function as delicate lenses of fresh water floating above denser seawater. Overuse, prolonged drought, or storm surges can compromise these lenses. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns note that some Pacific communities shifted inland towards shrinking freshwater springs or relocated closer to the few stable sources that remained. We do not know exactly how these people understood the hydrology beneath their feet, but the archaeological record suggests an acute awareness of seasonal fluctuations. When fresh water became unreliable, the island's carrying capacity diminished. Eventually, the need to seek more dependable water sources may have outweighed the risks of open ocean travel. Archaeological charcoal layers from multiple Pacific islands add another dimension to this story. In many sites, layers of charcoal appear suddenly and in density, indicating increased burning for agriculture. These burn layers correspond to periods of environmental stress, suggesting that communities expanded dryland farming in response to declining yields near water sources. Burning cleared forest vegetation, making room for crops suited to drier conditions. But this practice could also exacerbate the loss of soil moisture, increasing runoff and reducing the island's capacity to retain water. Over generations, the cumulative effect of burning may have transformed landscapes that had once supported stable populations. The archaeological strata capture this shift as thin black bands of carbon, marking the times when people tried to reshape the environment to feed themselves. Another clue lies in the salinization of coastal lagoons. As sea levels subtly shifted throughout the first millennium before the Common Era, saltwater intrusion into freshwater lagoons became more common. These lagoons had served as critical sources of drinking water, fish, and agricultural irrigation. Sediment cores from several islands show increased salinity during this period, with microfossils characteristic of marine environments replacing those associated with freshwater ecosystems. Lagoon salinization would have compounded the stress of declining rainfall, reducing both water availability and food productivity. For island communities already managing fragile ecosystems, even minor changes in sea level could have profound consequences. The combination of freshwater scarcity and declining lagoon health presented a formidable challenge, one that may have encouraged the most skilled navigators to look outward. The timing of canoe expansions aligns with these drought episodes. Archaeological evidence shows that major waves of inter-island voyaging occurred during intervals when environmental stress was particularly high. The construction of large voyaging canoes required significant investment of resources and labour, suggesting that these were not casual journeys, but strategic decisions made by communities facing ecological limitations. The spread of cultural artifacts, language patterns, and genetic markers across vast distances indicates intentional colonization rather than accidental drift. We do not know the exact motivations of these voyagers, but the environmental data suggests they left from landscapes that could no longer sustain growing populations. The canoes they built were not only vessels of exploration, but responses to ecological necessity. Cultural narratives from across the Pacific also reflect this connection between wayfinding and survival. Oral traditions describe ancestors who sailed in search of new lands because their home islands could no longer support them. Some stories speak of wells that ran dry, or forests that no longer produced food. Others emphasize the skill and courage required to navigate the open ocean, using stars, currents, and the flight patterns of birds. These narratives link the art of wayfinding with ecological awareness, suggesting that navigation emerged not only as a cultural achievement, but as a practical adaptation to changing environmental conditions. While these stories cannot be taken as literal historical accounts, they offer insight into how communities interpreted and remembered their migrations. When all these lines of evidence are considered together, a realization emerges with quiet clarity. Even the greatest seafaring traditions may have begun as quiet departures from dry land. The voyagers who crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean may have set sail not only because they were drawn by a sense of possibility, but because their home islands could no longer provide what they needed. These departures were not acts of desperation, but of calculated resilience, guided by deep knowledge of the sea and sky. The courage to leave arose from intimate familiarity with the limits of their environment. When water became scarce, they responded with movement, using their knowledge of navigation to expand the boundaries of their world. This perspective does not diminish the ingenuity of Pacific voyagers. It adds depth to their story, showing how environmental change shapes some of the most extraordinary acts of human exploration. It reminds us that movement is often rooted in necessity, and that ingenuity emerges most vividly at the edges of survival. The Pacific voyagers did not abandon their homelands. They carried their traditions, skills, and cosmologies with them across the ocean. Their journeys reshaped the cultural and genetic landscape of the Pacific, leaving traces that archaeologists, linguists, and anthropologists continue to uncover. And yet some civilizations responded not by leaving, but by building upward. A city so confident in the rhythms of water that it reshaped its entire landscape to control the monsoon. Picture vast reservoirs stretching across the earth like inland seas, canals threading through forests, embankments rising in geometric lines, all built on the belief that water could be captured, stored and released with precision. Can water abundance become a vulnerability? The story of Angkor, the medieval capital of the Khmer Empire, suggests that it can. For centuries, Angkor engineered its environment with extraordinary ambition, creating one of the largest urban landscapes of the pre-modern world. Yet the very scale that sustained the city became a point of fragility. When the climate shifted, the system that once guaranteed abundance began to unravel, revealing the limits of even the most sophisticated hydraulic vision. The revelation comes from high-resolution LiDAR mapping, which when first flown over Angkor, revealed a landscape far more intricate than archaeologists had imagined. Beneath the forest canopy appeared an immense network of canals, embankments, reservoirs, and orthogonal roads. The hydraulic system was not merely large, it was integrated across an area that stretched for dozens of kilometres. The LiDAR images show that as Angkor expanded between the 9th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, its water system grew in both scale and complexity. But this expansion also exposed the system's vulnerabilities. The more elaborate the network became, the more susceptible it was to disruption. We do not know whether Angkor's engineers recognized this fragility, but geoarchaeological surveys suggest that by the 13th century, the city's water management required near-perfect functioning across hundreds of interconnected components. At the core of this system were the massive bares, monumental reservoirs designed to regulate monsoon cycles. The East Bare and West Bare, each several kilometres long, held vast quantities of water that could be distributed to agricultural fields or urban areas. These bares allowed Angkor to store monsoon rains, smoothing out the variability between wet and dry seasons. They also symbolised the political and religious authority of Angkor's rulers, who used hydraulic control as a demonstration of power. Yet the size of these reservoirs meant that maintaining them required continuous labour to dredge sediment, reinforce embankments, and manage inflow and outflow. Over time, sediment accumulated, reducing their capacity. Sediment cores extracted from the bares show layers of fine-grained deposits that increase during periods of heavy rainfall, suggesting that the reservoirs gradually lost volume as they filled with silt washed down from surrounding slopes. The effort required to keep them functional grew with each generation. Evidence of infrastructural overcomplexity becomes clear when examining the layout of Angkor's canals. The system depended on carefully calibrated gradients to move water across a largely flat landscape. Even slight deviations in elevation could disrupt flow. Archaeologists have found signs of repeated modifications to canal edges, suggesting that engineers continually adjusted the system to maintain balance. But every modification created new dependencies. A blockage or collapse in one section could affect areas far downstream. As the city expanded, these dependencies multiplied. The hydraulic system, once a source of stability, became increasingly brittle. When changes occurred, whether caused by sediment, vegetation, or structural decay, the entire network required attention. Climate variability intensified this fragility. Paleoclimate studies show that during the 13th and 14th centuries of the Common Era, monsoon patterns became increasingly unpredictable. Periods of intense rainfall alternated with prolonged drought. These fluctuations placed contradictory pressures on a system designed for relative stability. During drought years, reservoirs could not recharge adequately, reducing the water available for rice agriculture. During flood years, sudden heavy rains overwhelmed canals, eroded embankments, and sent torrents of water into areas not designed to handle such volume. Sediment accumulation accelerated during these episodes, further diminishing the capacity of reservoirs and disrupting flow. The hydraulic system was vast, but it was built upon assumptions of climatic regularity. When those assumptions failed, the system strained. Geoarchaeological surveys document sudden failures in canal flow during this period. In some cases, channels became clogged with sediment or collapsed under hydraulic pressure. In others, water began to flow backward, undermining embankments and creating breaches that redirected water unpredictably. These failures appear suddenly in the archaeological record, marked by changes in sediment deposition and the rapid infilling of channels. They suggest that parts of the network ceased functioning within short intervals. Once certain canals failed, water could no longer reach key areas of the city, disrupting agriculture and domestic supply. Angkor's population depended on the efficiency of this system, and when it faltered, the consequences were immediate. We do not know whether Angkor's decline was experienced as a gradual deterioration or as a series of sharp shocks. The archaeological record suggests both. Long-term sedimentation and infrastructural strain punctuated by moments of catastrophic failure. What is clear is that the scale of Angkor's hydraulic engineering made it vulnerable to shifts in climate. The very structures that supported the city became liabilities when the system could no longer adjust. Too much engineering can make a civilization dependent on precision that the climate does not promise. Angkor's decline teaches us that mastery over water is temporary when the system's complexity surpasses its resilience. Yet it would be wrong to interpret this as a failure of imagination. Angkor's engineers created an extraordinary network that functioned effectively for centuries. Their work reflects an understanding of local hydrology, soil conditions, and monsoon rhythms that remains impressive today. But the system was rooted in a particular climatic regime, one that changed in ways no engineer could anticipate. The vulnerability of Angkor lay not in its ambition, but in the mismatch between its hydraulic scale and the growing unpredictability of the environment. When monsoons became erratic, the stability that the berries once offered began to crumble. This story reveals a broader truth about the relationship between human societies and water. Systems built to regulate abundance can become fragile when abundance fluctuates. Precision becomes a form of dependence, and complexity becomes a source of vulnerability. Angkor's reservoirs stand today as silent witnesses to this dynamic. Their outlines remain visible from the air, filled with rainwater and vegetation, reminders of a time when engineering sought to command the monsoon itself. From the ground they appear as lakes, but their historical depth lies in the sediment that accumulated within them, marking centuries of effort and eventual overextension. Other cities built not scale but proximity to the last reliable trickles of water. Imagine living in a place where the difference between survival and abandonment is measured in millimeters of rain. Picture a city built not beside a vast river or on the edge of a monsoon basin, but within a landscape where every drop of moisture must be memorized, anticipated, and protected. How close can a city come to the limits of survivable moisture? To explore this question, we step into the American Southwest, where the ancestral Puebloan world flourished for centuries in a region defined by dramatic swings in rainfall. Here, settlements arose along narrow ecological thresholds, balancing precariously between abundance and scarcity. Their story is not one of sudden disaster, but of a long negotiation with the limits of dryness. The revelation comes from tree ring chronologies, a paleoclimate archive carved silently into the wood of centuries-old conifers. These chronologies reveal severe multi-year droughts during key periods of ancestral Puebloan settlement, including the interval around the late 12th century of the Common Era. Each ring documents a year's growing conditions, creating a record of rainfall and temperature fluctuations that archaeologists can correlate with settlement patterns. What emerges is a picture of a society constantly adjusting to environmental variability. When the rings narrow, signalling drought, we see corresponding changes in architecture, agriculture, and movement. These rings do not merely describe climate, they illuminate the pressures under which communities lived, built, and eventually departed. One of the striking features of this landscape is the placement of great houses, monumental structures within the Chakra network. Many of these great houses were constructed near seeps and seasonal springs, places where groundwater slowly emerges from rock formations. These seeps were not abundant, but they were reliable enough to support agriculture and domestic needs in regions where rainfall alone could not sustain large communities. Archaeological surveys show a deliberate clustering of great houses around these water sources, suggesting a deep understanding of the landscape's hidden hydrology. Even small variations in seep flow may have shaped decisions about construction, expansion, and abandonment. The great houses appear as acts of both engineering and trust, built near water that could vanish in a single dry year. Evidence from marginal farmlands further reveals how close to the ecological edge these communities lived. Soil studies and excavation of agricultural fields show signs of crop failure during prolonged droughts. Corn, the staple crop of the region, demands consistent moisture at critical stages of growth. When rainfall faltered, fields that once yielded enough to support families produced only sparse harvests. Archaeologists find abandoned terraces, eroded check dams, and fields left unplanted in later layers, indicating periods when the land no longer rewarded labour. These failures were not uniform across the region. Pockets of land with slightly better moisture retention may have continued to support small populations, while others became unsustainable. This patchwork allowed some communities to persist while others diminished, creating a dynamic landscape of shifting habitation. The abandonment of Chaco Canyon stands as one of the clearest examples of these thresholds being crossed. By the late 12th century, prolonged aridity made it increasingly difficult to sustain the population of this ceremonial and political centre. Tree ring evidence points to a severe drought during this period, and archaeological records show declining construction activity, reduced storage capacity, and the gradual departure of residents. Chaco did not fall in the dramatic sense of a ruined city overtaken by external forces. Instead, its people dispersed to areas with more predictable water sources. The canyon's monumental architecture remained, silent and imposing, while its inhabitants followed moisture into surrounding regions. These movements reflect a strategic response to environmental stress, not collapse driven by crisis. Migration into slightly wetter uplands provides another layer to the story. As lowland areas became increasingly dry, communities shifted toward higher elevations where precipitation was more reliable and growing seasons were less constrained. Excavations of upland settlements show evidence of new construction during the same periods that lowland sites were abandoned. These sites often feature smaller communal structures and appear more evenly distributed across the landscape. The movement into upland suggests a decentralization of population, a dispersal that allowed people to take advantage of microclimates less affected by the droughts gripping the lowlands. Archaeologists interpret this as a strategic adaptation, spreading risk across a wider territory where no single dry year would prove catastrophic. When all of these threads are woven together, a quiet realization emerges. Some worlds vanish not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow retreat from thresholds crossed one dry season at a time. The ancestral Puebloan world was shaped by water scarcity from the beginning, but prolonged drought pushed communities to the very edges of habitability. Their response was not sudden abandonment, but measured dispersal, guided by deep knowledge of the land. They built where water whispered through rock. They planted in soils that could hold the faintest moisture. They moved when the margins contracted. Their history is one of resilience as much as departure. This perspective shifts how we understand the past. It reminds us that collapse is often gradual, the cumulative result of decisions made under environmental pressure. The ancestral Pueblans did not succumb to a single failure, but to a sequence of dry years that eroded the ecological foundations of their settlements. Their migrations reflect both vulnerability and adaptability, revealing a society intimately attuned to its environment. The great houses remain as monuments to their knowledge and ambition, but the story of their departure lies in the tree rings, the abandoned fields, and the subtle pathways leading into wetter lands. And as climate shifted globally, even mighty river cities discovered that abundance could reverse. Across the southwest, smaller settlements reveal yet another dimension of this slow retreat. Excavations at outlying sites show a gradual reduction in storage capacity, with fewer large communal rooms and more distributed household granaries. This pattern suggests a shift toward decentralization, as families relied increasingly on their own reserves rather than regional redistribution. Such architectural changes indicate that cooperation did not end but transformed, becoming more local as ecological predictability declined. When rainfall fluctuates widely, the security of shared granaries becomes difficult to maintain, and communities often turn to household-level buffering strategies. These structural changes speak to a society negotiating scarcity with pragmatism rather than panic. Even ceramic production reflects adjustments to diminishing moisture. Petrographic studies of pottery from this period show increased use of temper materials available in upland zones, such as crushed igneous rock, suggesting that potters either moved with migrating communities or travelled farther to acquire suitable resources. Pottery styles become more regionally diverse as populations dispersed, indicating that social networks reoriented themselves around new ecological centres. The decline of standardized ceramic traditions mirrors the dissolution of Chaco Canyon's influence, revealing cultural shifts intertwined with environmental boundaries. Rock art from the later occupation layers also offers subtle insight. Some panels depict increasingly abstract patterns, perhaps reflecting symbolic or ritual responses to environmental uncertainty. While we must be cautious about assigning definitive meaning, the locations of these panels, often near dwindling springs or along migration corridors, hint that they may have served as markers of movement or places of communal reflection. These carvings remind us that landscape and meaning evolved together, shaped by the pressures of dryness and the choices it demanded. Botanical remains collected from upland sites reveal an expansion of dietary diversity during this transition. Communities incorporated more wild plants, such as pinon nuts and amaranth, which thrive in higher elevations and require less predictable rainfall. This diversification suggests broad ecological knowledge and a willingness to reorganize subsistence strategies. Rather than viewing drought as an ending, these communities adapted by enlarging the spectrum of foods they relied upon, drawing from multiple ecological zones to maintain resilience. Regional road systems provide additional evidence of shifting priorities. Some ancient road segments leading toward Chaco Canyon show signs of disuse, while new footpaths appear carved into upland soils. These paths are not monumental like the engineered roads that once connected great houses, but they represent meaningful choices, movements towards sustainability rather than the maintenance of a shrinking centre. The landscape retains these faint traces, recording the directions in which people place their hope. What emerges from this mosaic of evidence is not a portrait of collapse, but of recalibration. The ancestral Puebloan world responded to dryness through countless small decisions: where to farm, where to build, where to gather water, and ultimately where to move. These choices accumulated over generations, creating a pattern of dispersal that mirrored the ecological gradients of the region. It is a reminder that civilizations do not always end with finality. Sometimes they diffuse, transforming into new configurations as the land shifts beneath them. This slow, adaptive retreat invites us to see the past not only through moments of abandonment, but through the resilience embedded in each decision to stay one more year, to plant one more field, to listen closely to the water's diminishing voice before following it elsewhere. Picture a river so revered that entire civilizations grew along its banks, and yet so feared that it earned a name whispered with resignation rather than affection. Imagine a current carrying both life and destruction, capable of feeding millions while remaking the land with a violence that no levee could ever fully restrain. How does the river known as China's Sorrow hold both life and destruction in the same current? To answer this, we must follow the Yellow River through the centuries in which it nourished fields, drowned towns, changed course without warning, and forced societies to acknowledge that abundance can turn against them. The revelation emerges from the geological structure of the river itself. The Yellow River carries silt at rates unmatched by any major river on Earth, drawing vast quantities of fine loess from the highlands of the Loess Plateau. Over centuries, this sediment accumulated along the riverbed, raising it above the level of the surrounding plains. Deforestation along the plateau accelerated this process, as exposed soils eroded quickly during rainfall, feeding even more sediment into the river's flow. We do not know the moment when people first realized that their river was rising above their fields, but historical and geological evidence shows that by the first millennium before the Common Era, the river had already become prone to catastrophic flooding. These floods were not ordinary overflows. When levees failed, the river burst through with enough force to carve new channels across the landscape, burying farmlands beneath meters of fresh silt and rearranging the geography of entire provinces. Historical chronicles preserve the memory of repeated levee breaches. Dynastic histories describe officials dispatched to repair embankments, armies conscripted to shore up defences, and fields left unusable after the river shifted course. These accounts appear again and again across dynasties, indicating that floods were not isolated disasters, but recurring features of life along the Yellow River. Some records speak of years in which entire administrative districts were submerged, forcing the relocation of tens of thousands of people. The chronicles do not dramatize these events. They recount them with a matter-of-fact tone, as if disaster had become part of the seasonal rhythm. This tone reveals a society accustomed to the unpredictability of a river that could not be fully controlled, despite relentless attempts to restrain it. Siltation rates, documented in geological studies, provide a physical explanation for these narrative patterns. Sediment cores extracted from ancient floodplains show layers of fine loess several meters thick, deposited during flood events when the river deposited enormous amounts of sediment across the land. These layers record the moments when the river remade its surroundings. Once deposited, the silt created fertile soil, but its abundance also required constant management. As the riverbed rose, levees had to be built ever higher, creating embankments that paradoxically increased the risk of catastrophic flooding. Each new layer of silt raised the stakes. A breach meant not simply an overflow, but the release of a river running above the level of the land, capable of sweeping across plains with little resistance. Farmers living along the river experienced these dynamics directly. Archaeological excavations reveal settlements periodically buried under silt, with new villages constructed atop older ones. In some regions, farmers abandoned fields overwhelmed by sediment and relocated to higher ground. leaving behind landscapes that still bear the scars of ancient floods. The river's shifting course forced successive generations to rebuild irrigation systems, re-establish property boundaries, and renegotiate their relationship with a landscape that refused to stay stable. This continual need for adaptation shaped the culture and economy of northern China, embedding an understanding of impermanence into the social fabric. State attempts to redirect channels reflect the political dimensions of this struggle. Imperial governments undertook massive hydraulic projects to control the Yellow River, mobilizing thousands of labourers to build canals, reinforce embankments, and clear silt from channels. Some projects temporarily succeeded in stabilizing the river's course, but others inadvertently increased tension on the system. Historical records describe bitter debates among officials regarding the best methods for managing the river. Some advocated for allowing it to wander naturally, while others insisted on control through engineering. In some periods, the state attempted to divert the river into alternative channels, projects that demanded immense human labour and resources. These interventions demonstrate both the ambition of imperial authority and the limits of human control over a river shaped by geological forces. Population displacements triggered by water unpredictability reveal the human cost of these dynamics. Floods forced entire communities to migrate, sometimes permanently. Historical census data show significant fluctuations in population across regions affected by the river's instability. Newly deposited land required reclamation, while areas trapped between levees and rising water levels became uninhabitable. Migration routes formed in response to these changes, contributing to demographic shifts that influenced political and social developments. The river did not simply shape the land, it shaped the distribution of people and resources across northern China. When viewed together, these traces, chronicles of levee breaches, siltation layers, buried settlements, state hydraulic projects, and migration patterns, offer a clear realization. Collapse can come not only from drought, but from the violence of too much water reshaping the earth beneath a civilization. The Yellow River didn't rebel. It behaved according to the physics of sediment, slope, and rainfall. But to the people who depended on its waters, its unpredictability became a defining feature of life. The river was both creator and destroyer, offering fertile soil while threatening everything built upon it. The story of its floods is not one of human failure, but of the tension between hydraulic ambition and the natural forces that continually exceeded it. And in other places, collapse emerged from a quieter source, the vanishing of the glacier itself. Beyond the chronicles and geological layers, the archaeological footprint of the Yellow River's volatility appears in the ruins of ancient flood control settlements. Excavations at certain administrative towns show a striking pattern of repeated rebuilding on elevated terraces, each constructed slightly higher than the last. These terraces grew like geological strata of human adaptation, each layer representing a generation that attempted to stay just ahead of the rising riverbed. Foundations of government granaries reveal similar upward migration, with floors resurfaced numerous times to remain usable above the floodplain. These adjustments record a society engaged in constant vigilance, reinforcing the idea that stability was always provisional. The material culture of households also reflects the lived reality of unpredictability. Ceramic assemblages in flood-affected regions show a preference for vessels with rounded bases and thicker walls, traits suited for storage in environments where rapid evacuation might be necessary. In some layers, archaeologists find bundles of domestic goods buried hastily beneath collapsed structures, as if families hoped to return after the waters receded. These intimate traces remind us that for most people, the Yellow River's behaviour was not an abstract hydrological issue, but a daily uncertainty shaping how they stored food, built homes and organised their domestic lives. One of the more subtle consequences of prolonged flooding was the reorganisation of regional economies. As farmland was repeatedly buried beneath fresh layers of silt, local markets could no longer depend on predictable grain supplies. Some regions that had once exported agricultural surplus became dependent on shipments from more stable areas. This shift altered trade patterns, making long-distance transport essential even within the supposedly self-sufficient agrarian zones of the empire. Archaeobotanical studies show an increased presence of drought-resistant millet in some flood-prone regions after major inundations, suggesting that communities altered their agricultural strategies to hedge against the loss of lowland fields. Hydrologically, the river's tendency to rise above the surrounding land created a phenomenon known as perched channels, in which water flowed along an embankment elevated well above adjacent communities. This precarious arrangement meant that any breach, whether caused by structural weakness, sabotage, or exceptional rainfall, sent water cascading downward with devastating force. Historical legal texts from several dynasties include severe penalties for damaging levees, indicating that society understood the consequences of even small disruptions. The river's elevation above the plains transformed local politics, making flood control officials among the most critical figures in provincial administration. Their decisions, failures, and rivalries often shaped the fate of thousands. Some of the river's most profound impacts are visible not in destruction, but in the patterns of resettlement that followed. Archaeological surveys reveal clusters of new villages founded along the margins of former flood zones, places where deposited silt eventually became fertile after years of stabilization. These resettlements demonstrate resilience. People return to reclaimed land despite knowing its history. But they also reveal a cyclical rhythm of environmental disturbance and human adjustment, a pattern in which the river continually rewrote the map, while communities responded with determination rather than resignation. Seen through this lens, the story of the Yellow River becomes not a tale of helplessness, but of a civilization perpetually negotiating with the dynamic landscape. The river was never simply a threat. It was an unpredictable partner in the making of northern China, offering renewal and ruin in alternating cycles that shaped culture, governance, and identity. Imagine standing in a high valley where the air feels thin enough to break, and watching a river begin its life as a slow breath of melt dripping from the edge of an ancient glacier. For most of human history, no one questioned why these waters arrived each spring with such dependability. The mountain was seen as a reservoir older than memory, a guardian whose cold crown promised continuity. Yet what happens to a river fed not by rain, but by ancient ice? What does a society do when the cold archive it depends on begins to shrink, altering the rhythm of melt on which entire worlds were built? We rarely picture collapse beginning in silence, but in these mountain civilizations it usually did, carried first in the subtle thinning of streams that once ran full without asking anything of the people who relied on them. We do not know for certain when the earliest communities in the Andes or the Himalayas noticed that their rivers behaved differently, but paleoglacial reconstructions suggest that the shift began long before anyone would have recognized it as change. By studying the chemical signatures locked in glacial cores and the sediment layers downstream, researchers have traced fluctuations in meltwater that predate written records by thousands of years. These shifts reveal that glaciers are not static monuments, but bodies in motion, expanding through centuries of cold, contracting through warmer intervals, and feeding rivers in pulses that follow the long, slow heartbeat of climate. It is this revelation that gives shape to the story. that civilizations rising beneath these mountains were bound not to rain clouds or monsoon paths, but to the mass of ice stored high above them, ice that had its own agenda, its own memory and its own breaking point. Archaeological work in the Andes shows terraces abandoned in what appear to be coordinated stages, each layer of abandonment corresponding to intervals when meltwater dropped below the threshold needed to support high-altitude agriculture. Farmers had engineered the land with remarkable precision, building stone-lined terraces that held moisture, slowed evaporation, and captured runoff. Yet even the most resilient design could not make up for reduced melt. In some valleys, pollen analysis indicates a quiet transition from staple crops to hardier species better able to tolerate drier soils. In others, entire slopes bear scars of once irrigated fields now left to wind and frost, testifying to a retreat not caused by war or political collapse, but by altered water arriving too late or too weak to sustain the system. In the Himalayas, the story unfolded differently, but the cause was similar. Sediment cores drawn from riverbeds show abrupt transitions in grain size and mineral composition, marking shifts in river flow that correspond to glacial variability rather than rainfall. These rivers, which appear strong and perennial today, once traced different paths, carved deeper channels, or thinned so dramatically that settlements relying on predictable seasonal melt were forced to adjust. Some communities moved downslope, seeking larger tributaries. Others reorganized their irrigation systems to stretch diminished flow across an expanding population. Archaeologists studying Himalayan foothill villages have found storage facilities enlarged during these intervals, suggesting that people compensated for melt uncertainty by preserving more grain, anticipating years when the river would not be enough. Irrigation in both mountain regions reveals the same pattern. It was not drought in the traditional sense that challenged these societies, nor overuse of river water, but a more elusive pressure. Seasonal melt, once the most reliable source of moisture, became inconsistent as glaciers withdrew. Channels that had been carefully calibrated to match historical flow began to carry either too little water or, during sudden melt pulses, far too much. In some Andean valleys, canals were narrowed repeatedly, then widened again generations later, mirroring the glacial pulse cycle recorded in ice cores. This constant reshaping of infrastructure hints at a population engaged in a quiet, continuous struggle with a diminishing source whose decline could be measured not in decades but in centuries. Migration records add another layer to this story. Linguistic patterns across the Himalayas indicate population movements that align with inferred periods of melt decline, suggesting that entire groups relocated when their ancestral rivers could no longer sustain intensive farming. In the Andes, the distribution of settlement clusters implies a gradual descent from high terraced slopes into lower valleys, where meltwater remained more stable. These relocations were not abrupt or catastrophic. They unfolded in slow, adaptive steps as families sought dependable water rather than hold their lives in place, while the mountain withdrew its support. Realization arrives quietly in the evidence. Some rivers fail not because of drought or mismanagement, and not through sudden violence, but because the mountains themselves exhale less water each year. Glaciers are timekeepers older than any civilization, and when their long memory shifts, the worlds below must shift with them. And where surface water faltered, people once turned downward into the earth. There is another layer to this story that emerges when we look not at settlements or terraces, but at the quiet, long-distance signals carried in river chemistry itself. Geologists studying melt-fed rivers in both mountain systems have found that the ratio of certain isotopes shifts when glacial mass shrinks, leaving a kind of chemical fingerprint of diminishing ice. These signatures show that reductions in meltwater began centuries before the archaeological record registers settlement change, suggesting that the people living beneath these mountains were responding to forces they could not perceive directly. To them, the river may have simply seemed more temperamental, arriving weeks later than expected, or thinning after only a short pulse of reliable flow. Yet in these isotopic traces we see the early stages of a slow systemic unravelling that would reshape entire regions. In the central Andes, this mismatch between human expectation and glacial rhythms appears in how societies reorganize storage and labour. Excavations of granaries show that their internal architecture shifted over time from small, family-sized units to larger communal structures, built to hold harvests from wider networks of fields. The reason becomes clearer when studying plant microfossils preserved in these granaries. There is a subtle increase in drought-tolerant crops, but there is also a rise in plants that mature at staggered intervals. This pattern suggests a deliberate strategy to hedge against uncertainty in meltwater timing, distributing risk across crops that demanded water in different months. It was an elegant response to an invisible pressure, a quiet form of resilience practiced by farmers who relied on patterns that had held for generations and were now beginning to drift. In the Himalayas, the response to melt variability can be traced not only through migration, but also through shifts in ritual landscapes. Some Himalayan communities appear to have elevated their shrines and ceremonial structures over time, repositioning them closer to sources of water rather than centres of habitation. Archaeologists studying these sites propose that water reliability had become not just a practical concern but a spiritual one, shaping how people conceptualize the boundary between human effort and the mountain's own agency. The relocation of ritual sites suggests that glacial melt had taken on a new meaning, one tied to dependence and vulnerability. By placing shrines near springs, these communities may have been acknowledging that the mountain's diminishing gift was now the most sacred resource of all. Even the tools people made reflect the strain of glacial change. In several Andean valleys, stone tools from later periods are manufactured from materials sourced farther downslope, indicating that quarry sites near the original settlements no longer had consistent water access to support long-term habitation by toolmakers. This movement of labour is a small detail, but it confirms that melt decline affected not just agriculture, but the entire web of activities that tied societies to the highlands. When we trace all of these lines together, chemical signals, crop strategies, ritual shifts, tool production, we see a shared pattern emerging across continents. These mountain civilizations were not undone by a sudden event, nor by a failure of ingenuity. They were negotiating with a force that moved on geological timescales, a retreat measured in centimetres per year, yet powerful enough to redirect the course of rivers and the destinies of the people who lived beside them. In this sense, glacial decline tells a quieter kind of collapse story, not one of catastrophe, but of gradual repositioning as communities recalibrated their lives to match the slow exhale of the mountains above them. Picture a moment when a community decides to build its future on something that no one can see, not a river carving through a valley, not a glacier gleaming on a distant ridge, but a darkness below the earth, holding water that moves in silence. Imagine people standing on a desert plain where the surface offers no hint of life, then choosing to settle not because they found water, but because they believed they could draw it out of the unseen. How do you build a civilization on a resource you can never see? This question carries us into the landscapes of ancient Iran, where a different kind of hydraulic ingenuity unfolded, one rooted not in taming rivers, but in following the hidden slope of an aquifer far beneath the ground. We do not know when the first qanat builders realised that underground water flowed along predictable gradients, but archaeological evidence suggests that by the early first millennium before the Common Era, communities had already begun carving gently descending tunnels that would channel this invisible water toward the surface. These qanats were feats of engineering achieved with neither surveying instruments nor written blueprints. Builders relied on accumulated generations of observation, mapping the land through intuition refined into skill. Each qanat consisted of a mother well dug deep into the aquifer, connected to a long underground channel whose gradient had to be precise. Too steep, and the water would erode the tunnel. Too shallow, and it would never emerge. The success of a qanat was measured in its quietness, a soft, steady flow that could last for centuries. The maintenance of these channels demanded a different form of cooperation, one inscribed directly into the architecture of the desert. Vertical shafts punctuated the landscape every few dozen meters, allowing workers to descend and remove collapsed sediment, repair the passage, or clear blockages. These shafts were not merely engineering features, they became markers of intergenerational responsibility. Families tied to a particular qanat inherited not only its benefits but its obligations, passing down the knowledge needed to keep the channel alive. In this sense, a qanat was not a structure but a relationship, binding people to one another through the shared custody of invisible water. As settlements expanded across Iran, their distribution rarely conformed to the logic of rivers. Instead, they appeared in arcs and clusters that followed the subterranean geometry of qanats. Entire towns were positioned at the points where underground flow met the surface, forming lush oases in landscapes otherwise inhospitable. Archaeological surveys show that the size of a settlement was often determined not by its surface geography, but by the volume of water a qanat could provide. It was an inverted map of civilization, one drawn not on the surface but beneath it. Yet even these systems, which had endured for generations, carried a vulnerability that was easy to overlook. Aquifers recharged slowly, fed by distant mountains and faint seasonal rains. When extraction exceeded this slow renewal, the mother wells drew lower each year, and the flow emerging at the surface dwindled. Qanat abandonment leaves a unique archaeological signature: collapsing shafts, dry channels filled with wind-blown sand, and nearby fields losing their fertility as irrigation ceased. Each abandoned qanat tells a story of water drawn faster than the earth could replace it, a silent collapse that unfolded beneath people's feet long before they recognized its cause. The final chapters of many qanat systems reveal another layer of complexity. As populations grew, some communities deepened their mother wells or constructed secondary qanats to draw from different parts of the aquifer. At first, this increased resilience, but as more channels tapped the same hidden reservoir, the balance shifted. Excavated settlement layers show increased reliance on storage pits and redirected flow in later periods, reflecting attempts to stretch diminishing water supplies. When the aquifer fell below the reach of even the deepest mother well, the system failed all at once. Civilization that had mastered unseen water survived, until the unseen disappeared. The deeper we look into these subterranean networks, the more they reveal about the society shaped by them. Qanats did not simply transport water. They reordered how time, labour, and authority functioned within the communities that depended on them. Archaeologists examining settlement layers in central Iran have noted that the seasonal rhythm of life changed dramatically once qanats became the primary source of water. Instead of following rainfall cycles, farmers followed maintenance cycles. After periods of heavy sediment accumulation, the vertical shafts demanded clearing, which required labour crews rotating through each village. Some of the oldest written contracts from the region concern not trade or land ownership, but the obligations families held toward the upkeep of their local qanat. These documents show fines for neglect, rewards for skilled excavation, and protocols for dividing water access fairly, suggesting that legal systems themselves were shaped by the invisible water they pursued. Further studies of collapsed qanats reveal how engineering responded to geological challenges. In certain regions where the soil was prone to collapse, builders reinforced tunnel walls with carefully interlocked stones that allowed water to seep through without letting sediment flood the passage. In others, where the aquifer lay deep within compacted gravel, workers expanded the diameter of mother wells so that airflow could reach them during excavation. These adaptations demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of subsurface geology long before scientific descriptions existed. It was knowledge acquired not through abstract theory, but through centuries of direct contact with the earth, with each excavation adding to a tacit archive of practical engineering. An unexpected clue to the relationship between qanat builders and their environment comes from botanical evidence around abandoned shafts. Pollen trapped in sediment layers shows that the presence of qanats altered local vegetation patterns, encouraging species that thrived in moist microenvironments created by seepage. Over generations, these ecological corridors supported orchards, shade trees and gardens that softened the desert's harshness. When a qanat failed, these plants vanished abruptly, leaving behind a botanical silhouette of the former water flow. The disappearance of these corridors points not just to ecological change, but to the collapse of entire cultural landscapes woven around invisible water arteries. Social stratification also deepened around the management of these systems. While the qanat belonged to the community, its design and construction required specialist knowledge. Excavators, known in some regions as muqanes, held a status distinct from farmers, shepherds, or traders. They were respected for skills that combined risk with precision. Archaeological evidence from burial sites near ancient qanat routes suggests that these specialists were commemorated differently, sometimes with grave goods associated with their craft, such as measuring cords or lamps. Their role in sustaining life made them indispensable, and their legacy remains etched across the desert in the straight lines of ventilation shafts that still dot the landscape. As centuries passed, some regions sought to increase the yield of their qanats by diversifying their sources. In a few valleys, later generations dug branch channels that tapped secondary aquifers or intercepted seepage from deeper geological layers. Initially, these expansions brought prosperity, allowing settlements to grow beyond what surface rainfall alone could support. But this also set the stage for a slow decline. When multiple channels drained the same aquifer, local water tables dropped more quickly than natural recharge could compensate. In some abandoned qanat systems, archaeologists have found secondary tunnels left unfinished, suggesting that builders realized mid-excavation that the water they sought was no longer reachable. The most revealing insight, however, comes from the spatial pattern of abandoned settlements. Some towns appear to vanish abruptly when a qanat failed, but others shifted only a short distance away, relocating to a different point where the underground channel still surfaced. This indicates that communities were not merely reacting to water scarcity. They were tracking the living pulse of the aquifer, adjusting their geography to its hidden pathways. Civilization, in these places, was not anchored to a location but to a moving boundary of underground moisture that shaped where life could persist. In the end, the story of qanat societies is not a tale of triumph or collapse, but of long negotiation with a shy, unseen partner. They survived as long as they could feel the pulse beneath them, and when that pulse faded, they left behind not ruined monuments or dried canals, but quiet lines in the earth, records of the moment the invisible ceased to flow. Imagine a shoreline that does not stay still. Picture a place where the distinction between river and sea is so delicate that a handful of storms or a shift in the Earth's surface can erase villages that once stood on solid ground. What happens when the boundary between land and water blurs beyond recognition? This question haunts the archaeological record of the world's great deltas, where entire settlements appear not as ruins one can walk through, but as memories preserved beneath layers of silt and salt. In these landscapes, water did not vanish, nor did it merely retreat. Instead, it returned in forms that slowly inverted the relationship people had with the soil beneath their feet. We do not know precisely when ancient Mediterranean communities first realized that their land was sinking, or that the sea was rising to meet them. The evidence suggests a process so gradual that no single generation would have named it as collapse. Sediment cores drawn from the Nile Delta and the Bay of Abukir show a pattern of fine silts overlaying cultural material, indicating that settlements were submerged not in a single flood, but through a long, quiet descent. These cores reveal layers where marine microfossils appear among pottery sherds and charcoal fragments, showing the moment the sea crossed an invisible threshold and began to claim the land. The story becomes clearer when coupled with archaeological surveys of submerged cities such as Heracleion and Eastern Canopus, where temples, warehouses and harbours rest beneath meters of water, preserved by the very force that erased them. The mechanics of this drowning are now better understood. Many delta plains suffer from natural subsidence as river sediments compact under their own weight. When rivers carry less silt, whether due to climatic shifts upstream or changes in land use, this subsidence accelerates. In some regions, such as the Western Nile Delta, tectonic adjustments further lowered the land. Sea level rise provided the final push. The Mediterranean, responding to long-term climatic cycles, rose enough over centuries to overtop natural levees and seep inland. In combination, these forces created a landscape where a millimetre here, a centimetre there, quietly determined whether fields remained fertile or turned to marsh. Historical accounts speak indirectly to this transformation. Greek and Roman geographers wrote of harbours that shifted, channels that silted up, and coastlines that no longer matched the descriptions found in earlier manuscripts. Their confusion is evident in the contradictions between maps made only a few centuries apart. What they were recording was not error, but motion, the slow liquefying of the delta beneath their world. As the sea encroached, human-built levees attempted to hold back the intrusion. These earthworks stretched for kilometres, forming fragile barriers between the fertile interior and the advancing coast. But levees built to resist river floods were never designed to stand against the persistent pressure of rising salt water. Archaeological excavations show repeated cycles of repair, raising, and eventual overtopping, after which settlements relocated inland and left the old earthworks to dissolve into tidal mud. The loss of agricultural capacity followed predictably from this transformation. Saltwater intrusion, detectable today through chemical signatures in ancient soils, destroyed harvests in areas that had been productive for centuries. Wheat and barley fields turned barren as salts accumulated, leaving communities dependent on diminishing patches of arable land farther from the coast. Archaeobotanical studies in submerged delta settlements reveal a shift from high-yield cereals to hardy, low-demand crops late in their occupation history, suggesting that farmers attempted to adapt even as the ground beneath them declined. But no crop could flourish in soil that tasted increasingly of the sea. Trade, too, was undone by this slow drowning. Harbours shifted as channels filled with silt or opened in new locations, forcing commercial centres to relocate or fade. Underwater surveys of the eastern Mediterranean coastline have uncovered anchor stones, amphora debris, and quay foundations lying far from the modern shore, marking places where ships once docked before the sea lifted them from their context. Some inland towns rose to prominence as new harbours formed, while once thriving port cities disappeared entirely, sacrificed to geological rhythms no ruler could command. The geography of exchange, grain, papyrus, wine, ceramics, was remapped by the same forces that altered the coastline. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for deltic instability comes from the pattern of religious architecture. Temples, often built on raised platforms, show signs of reconstructive elevation in their later phases. In some submerged temple complexes, excavations reveal multiple stacked pavements, each one built higher than the last. This suggests that priests and builders recognized the encroaching water, but believed they could outpace it through architecture. The final pavement, usually the thickest, marks the moment human intervention ceased to match the rising tide. Beneath that surface lies a quiet acknowledgement that the land could no longer be persuaded to remain land. Across these delta plains, disappearance did not take the shape of ruin but of dispersal. House foundations softened into mud, walls collapsed into sediment, and streets retrieved their original form as channels. The sea absorbed what people built, leaving no desert ruins or mountain fortresses, only outlines revealed through sonar and archaeological dives. In these submerged cities, collapse was not an event but a gradient, the gradual surrender of ground to water that remembered its ancient boundaries and reclaimed them. Realization arrives in the pattern. Water does not only leave, sometimes it returns in forms that undo the worlds built upon its absence, and when it does, collapse does not roar. It rises. Another window into this slow transformation comes from the study of ancient river distributaries captured beneath the sea floor. Marine geologists mapping submerged deltic channels have found that many ancient rivers once fanned widely across plains that no longer exist. By tracing the shape of these drowned channels, researchers can reconstruct the vanished geography that once held farms, roads, and marketplaces. These discoveries reveal something important. Deltas are not fixed landscapes, but restless negotiations between sediment and tide. For much of antiquity, human settlement patterns assumed stability that the delta itself never promised. The archaeological record shows that people continually adjusted to shifting distributaries, but in the periods of rapid sea level rise, adaptation could not keep pace with the changing shape of the land. Some distributaries closed entirely, sealing off harbours. Others carved new paths into areas once considered safely inland. The loss of delta societies is also preserved in the material they left behind, material that now lies underwater, yet remains surprisingly intact. In some submerged Mediterranean settlements, amphorae still sit in storerooms sealed by silt, their clay surfaces coated with fine marine sediments. In others, wooden beams, preserved by anoxic mud, retain tool marks that speak to the labour of carpenters who never imagined their work would one day rest beneath the sea. These artefacts form a strange time capsule in which the line between land and water is reversed. What once lay in open air now resides in the cold quiet of the ocean floor. What emerges from these finds is not a narrative of sudden catastrophe, but of gradual displacement, families relocating inland, merchants seeking new harbours, priests performing rituals in places they hoped would remain sacred a little longer. One of the most telling indicators of deltic decline is the changing distribution of freshwater wells. In many ancient deltas, well shafts show a rising intrusion of saline water in their later phases, a phenomenon detectable through mineral residues lining the interior. These residues form a distinct banding pattern, each layer marking a moment when the freshwater lens beneath the ground thinned and salt water pushed inland. As this boundary shifted, communities dug deeper wells or constructed new ones farther from the coast, but each generation found the same pattern repeating, the invisible line of fresh water retreating more quickly than any human infrastructure could follow. The archaeological map of abandoned wells becomes, in effect, a map of slow surrender. Even coastal cemeteries reflect the transformation. Excavations reveal graves truncated by erosion or partially consumed by marine processes. Bones lie tilted at angles that match the direction of land subsidence. These burial grounds stand as silent markers of a shoreline that migrated across sacred spaces, reshaping how communities oriented themselves toward death and memory. For archaeologists, such cemeteries provide a rare human-scale view of deltic instability. The living moved inland, but the dead remained at the boundary where land yielded to rising water. Another layer of evidence comes from the ceramics industry. Clay sources in delta regions are often tied to specific sediment compositions. When river mouths shifted or saltwater intrusion altered the mineral properties of local deposits, potters were forced either to adjust their firing techniques or to import clay from upland areas. Petrographic analysis of pottery shards shows abrupt changes in clay provenance during periods of coastal transformation. This suggests that technological traditions were disrupted not by conquest or cultural diffusion, but by landscape instability. Even the vessels used for daily life record the changing dialogue between sediment and sea. Taken together, these lines of evidence reveal a pattern of quiet displacement unfolding across centuries. The delta did not collapse in a moment. It moved, breathed, and remade itself while the people living upon it tried to follow its shifting contours. In its final stages, the sea's return was not a single flood, but a slow erasure, a rewriting of land into water. Imagine walking through a landscape where the noise of human life has been removed so completely that even the earth seems unsure anyone ever lived there. Picture entering a valley that once held the sound of flowing water, the rhythm of fields being worked, the murmur of communities gathered at the edge of a canal, and finding instead only wind moving through abandoned earthworks. What remains of a civilization when its water disappears, moves, or turns against it? In the archaeological record, the answer is not found in ruins or monuments, but in a stillness that settles over everything once the hydrological pulse that sustained a society fades. It is a kind of quiet that does not announce collapse but reveals it, one contour at a time. Across continents and millennia, the traces of water-shaped collapse share a strange consistency. We see it first in the canals that cut across ancient plains, long ribbons of engineered soil that once shimmered with life. In many regions, archaeologists find these canals filled not with silt from active irrigation, but with layers of dust and wind-blown sand, each strata marking another season when farmers did not return to clear them. The walls remain surprisingly intact, suggesting that no catastrophic event destroyed them. Instead, their abandonment was an erosion of intention. These dry channels become scars, mapping the shape of vanished labour and the habits of communities who once walked along their banks. In other places, desertified fields carry the last marks of plough lines in patterns that look almost fragile. Soil micromorphology reveals the final stage of cultivation, a thin layer of disturbed sediment, followed abruptly by undisturbed natural deposits. This shift means that the ploughs did not break or fall into disuse, they simply stopped being pulled. The fields retain the geometry of human effort, but nothing of its continuity. In some cases, Phytoliths trapped within the topsoil show what the last crops were: small residues of barley, millet or wheat lodged within dust that arrived only after the farmers had gone. These faint biological traces form the final botanical chapter of communities whose rhythms once relied on water that no longer came. Flood layers tell a different story, one of sudden displacement rather than gradual abandonment. Excavations in riverine homes show sequences where domestic floors are sealed beneath coarse, water-laid sediments. Sometimes the layers contain fragments of pottery or tools that indicate people fled quickly, carrying little. In rare cases, footprints preserved in silt show inhabitants moving toward higher ground, the impressions of their departure caught in a moment when the river claimed their dwellings. These flood deposits create a geological snapshot, a single season, or even a single day, in which the river reorganized the landscape and signaled that rebuilding would no longer be possible. Wells provide yet another kind of silence. Where groundwater receded or turned brackish, communities often filled their wells deliberately, a practical and symbolic act marking the end of habitation. Archaeologists identify these closures by the pattern of fill. The lower layers composed of wind-driven sediment, the upper layers containing broken household objects, stones, and occasionally offerings associated with departure. This methodical closing of a well suggests that people understood the loss of water as a final threshold. Once the earth ceased to breathe upward, the settlement could no longer justify its presence. Perhaps the most telling evidence of hydrological collapse is what is missing: the absence of rebuilding. In regions struck by political upheaval or war, new structures often rise atop the ruins of old ones, creating stacked layers of rebuilding visible in stratigraphy. But where water vanished, these layers do not appear. Instead, settlements end abruptly. Their horizons shift not into reconstruction, but into natural deposition. Wind-blown dust, encroaching dune fields, or floodplain silt. It is this absence of return that reveals the depth of dependency humans have on the smallest hydrological fluctuations. The soil records a final moment of occupation, then folds back into its pre-human rhythms, covering the traces of houses, workshops, and granaries that once relied on a source that refused to come back. Realization emerges quietly from all of this. The story of collapse is not a story of failure, but of the deep dependency of all human worlds on the smallest shifts in the hydrological cycle. Civilizations do not rise or fall by will alone. They rise where water lingers, and they fall where it withdraws. Water shapes not only landscapes, but the limits of imagination, determining where communities take root, how they endure, and when they must finally leave. Another aspect of hydrological silence emerges when archaeologists examine the distribution of small, often overlooked artifacts left behind in water-dependent regions. In many abandoned settlements, these objects, grinding stones, storage jars, bone awls, appear in the exact positions they were last used. Unlike sites destroyed by conflict, where debris scatters chaotically, water-lost settlements exhibit an eerie order. Tools sit beside hearths untouched, and household vessels remain clustered in corners designed for storage. This spatial stillness reveals that departure was not frantic but resigned. People left when it became clear that the land would no longer reward their return. Archaeologists sometimes describe such sites as paused, their final moments preserved not by disaster but by absence. In some desert regions, archaeologists find sequences of shallow pits that once served as planting depressions for crops requiring minimal irrigation. The earliest pits reveal careful shaping and symmetry consistent with active cultivation. Later pits, however, show deterioration, uneven spacing, incomplete walls, and in some cases no evidence of planting at all. This degradation suggests that farmers continued trying to extend their growing seasons or capture the last traces of moisture even after conditions became untenable. These pits form a fading record of stubbornness, acts of agricultural persistence made in hope rather than expectation. Drainage channels provide another line of insight. When a community abandons a settlement due to lack of water, the channels designed to remove excess water often become repositories for windborne sediments. Over centuries, these channels fill with layers that alternate between fine silts and coarse granules, marking periods of shifting climate variability long after human occupation ceased. These strata become informal climate archives, mapping decades or centuries of environmental change in the absence of human response. They tell a story the people themselves did not stay to witness. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from unfinished construction. At a number of hydrologically collapsed sites, archaeologists identify foundations for buildings that were never completed. Rectangular outlines carved into the ground, half-built walls, or abandoned bricks still stacked beside empty foundations suggest that plans for expansion continued, even as water decline approached a critical threshold. These false beginnings illustrate a community living at the boundary between optimism and inevitability. Hope carried forward in architecture until the last workable season made clear that continuity was no longer possible. Even religious sites bear the imprint of hydrological abandonment. In some ancient societies, shrines or altars were placed near springs, wells, or river crossings tied to local cosmologies. When water disappeared, these sites show abrupt cessation of offerings. Broken vessels used for rituals lie scattered at thresholds rather than within the sacred zone, suggesting a final ceremony performed at the edge rather than inside. In other cases, the altars remain intact but devoid of the votive layers that mark active practice. The silence in these places is palpable, not as destruction, but as a final gesture of reverence before departure. Burial grounds also reflect this hydrological quieting. In settlements struck by war or political upheaval, graves often continue to expand even after the living move elsewhere. But in water-lost regions, necropolises abruptly stop growing. The final burials coincide with the last viable years of habitation, and then the soil holds no further human presence. This alignment between burial continuity and water availability provides archaeologists with one of the clearest indicators of when a community reached its tipping point. When the hydrological foundation dissolved, even the dead ceased to anchor the living to the land. One of the subtler indicators of collapse is the disappearance of pottery shards. In regions where people continue to occupy a landscape, ceramic fragments accumulate endlessly across the surface, forming a recognizable archaeological signature. But in abandoned hydrological landscapes, the shard density often becomes static, frozen to the moment of last occupation. Wind eventually buries these fragments or scatters them into low dunes, leaving some surfaces curiously clean. This absence of continuous ceramic deposition becomes, in its own way, a record of silence, a geological pause where human activity once left an unbroken trail. And finally, there is the silence of soundscapes reconstructed through paleo-environmental methods. Scientists studying ancient pollen distributions and sediment acoustics have begun to estimate how landscapes sounded in the past. The density of vegetation, the presence of running water, the likelihood of human noise. In water-lost civilizations, these reconstructed soundscapes show dramatic transitions, from river-rich ecosystems filled with insect and birds to environments where wind dominates the acoustic profile. Archaeologists cannot hear these vanished soundscapes directly, but the shift in ecological markers allows them to infer the moment when human voices fell quiet, and the land reclaimed its original silence. All of these traces, abandoned tools, deteriorating planting pits, sediment-filled channels, unfinished buildings, silent shrines, halted burial grounds, static pottery layers, and reconstructed soundscapes, reveal collapse not as a single moment, but as a transition between two kinds of silence: the silence of water withdrawing and the silence of people following it.